You didn't just surprise them. That's the part they still don't know how to say out loud. Surprise implies expectation. This was worse. This was the moment trained minds froze because what you didn't arrive through any channel they were watching. Somewhere in a room with bad lighting and colder coffee. People whose job is to predict behavior stared at screens that suddenly felt untrustworthy. Not because the data was wrong, but because the conclusion refused to sit still. You weren't supposed to move like that. You weren't supposed to think that way. And yet there it was, already done, already irreversible, already forcing recalculation. Right now, there are people with clearances you'll never hear about scrolling backward through your trail. Not to admire it, but to locate the error. They are not asking what you did. They are asking how they missed the moment you became capable of doing it. Because their confidence depends on one belief, that nothing meaningful happens without leaving a trace they can monitor. You violated that belief without announcing yourself. No alarms, no build-up, just results sitting where there shouldn't be results yet. That's what rattled them first. They started with the obvious explanations, external help, hidden backing, some unseen advantage. They needed something outside of you to point at, because the alternative was unacceptable. The alternative was that you made a decision before permission appeared, before consensus formed, before approval had time to dress itself up as caution. That kind of move terrifies people trained to wait for confirmation, especially when the outcome works. What's happening behind the scenes right now isn't anger. It's escalation, quiet, clipped conversations, names mentioned without context, screens shared without commentary. They replay the sequence again and again, not because it changes, but because they expect it to. Because trained minds are uncomfortable when cause and effect don't line up the way they were taught. You didn't follow the standard arc. No gradual warming, no public preparation, no visible struggle phase they could tag and label. You skipped the part they rely on to feel in control. They're trying to map your behavior onto familiar profiles. That's where the real panic starts. You don't fit. You don't over-explain. You don't perform competence. You don't telegraph intent. You didn't signal hunger or desperation or the usual tells. You moved as if the outcome was already settled internally long before it appeared externally. That breaks models. That creates doubt. And doubt, in rooms like those, spreads faster than certainty. Someone suggested you got lucky. That suggestion didn't last long. Luck leaves fingerprints, patterns, repeatable errors. What you did showed restraint, timing, and a refusal to chase recognition. That combination is rare, not flashy, not loud, just precise. Precision without visible rehearsal is what made the room go quiet in that particular way, where no one wants to be the next person to speak. They started pulling everything, old posts, old decisions, minor choices that didn't seem important at the time. They're trying to reconstruct a version of you that makes sense to them. The problem is, they're starting from the wrong assumption. They believe transformation announces itself. They believe capability grows in public. They believe pressure creates tells. You disproved all of that by operating privately and delivering publicly. By the time they noticed, the move had already settled into reality. What unsettles them most is not the scale of what you pulled off. It's the restraint surrounding it. No victory lap, no explanation thread, no attempt to frame the narrative. You didn't rush to be understood. You didn't try to control interpretation. You let the results speak and left the room mentally before anyone finished reacting. That behavior doesn't match ambition as they understand it. It matches something else entirely. Something colder, something more settled. They're comparing timelines now, yours versus everyone else's, and it doesn't add up. Where others accumulate visible effort, you accumulated clarity. Where others seek validation before moving, you moved and let validation scramble to catch up. That inversion is what's causing the stress fractures in their thinking. Because if your approach works, then the long rituals they've trusted start to look optional. And if those rituals are optional, a lot of authority loses weight overnight. Behind closed doors, someone asked the question no one wanted to answer. What if this wasn't a one-off? What if this is how you operate now? Not reactive, not loud, just deliberate, detached, already 3 steps past the conversation everyone else is still having. That question changed the tone of the room, because a single unexpected success can be dismissed. A pattern forces respect. They're watching how others respond to you. That's the tell. Not your behavior, but the shift around you. Conversations recalibrate when your name comes up. People hesitate before speaking. Comparisons start forming without permission. You've become a reference point without trying to be one. And reference points are dangerous because they reorganize hierarchy quietly. Notice how no one is publicly confronting you. That's not courtesy, that's caution. Direct engagement would require them to acknowledge you as a peer or a variable worth addressing. They're not ready for that, so they observe instead. They analyze at a distance. They build theories that allow them to keep their existing worldview intact for a little longer. They tell themselves you must have had access others didn't, that you must have known something secret, that you must have bent a rule somewhere. Anything to avoid the conclusion that you simply chose differently, earlier, faster, with less need for reassurance. Because if that's true, then hesitation starts to look like a personal failure rather than wisdom. What's fascinating is how much energy they're spending trying to understand you, while you're not spending any thinking about them at all. That asymmetry is not lost on the sharper minds in the room. Attention usually flows toward power. Right now, it's flowing toward you without invitation. And the more they focus, the more they reveal their own limits. They're especially disturbed by how calm the outcome looks. No chaos, no mess, no visible scramble, just a clean shift from one state to another. That kind of movement suggests preparation that didn't need witnesses. It suggests inner alignment that didn't require applause. And that's uncomfortable for institutions built around visibility and consensus. Someone pulled up an old assessment of you. It didn't age well. That happens when people mistake potential for trajectory. They assumed you would move when conditions were right, when support appeared, when the environment softened. You moved when your internal position was settled. Those are very different triggers. One is external, one is final. They're not saying this part out loud, but it's there beneath the analysis. If you can do this without signaling, without gathering permission, without asking to be taken seriously, then others might try. And if others try, the entire structure of predictability they rely on starts to wobble. You didn't just act. You demonstrated a mode of operation that bypasses their filters. Now they're paying attention to what you don't do. You don't rush to clarify. You don't correct misinterpretations. You don't soften your edges to be more palatable. You let people sit with their confusion. That restraint reads as confidence, whether you intend it or not. It forces everyone else to do the emotional labor you refused to do for them. The irony is, you're not trying to unsettle anyone. You're not posturing. You're not playing a long intimidation game. You're simply aligned with your own decisions. But alignment without apology is disruptive to environments addicted to negotiation and delay. They feel it as pressure because it exposes the gap between thought and action they've been living with for years. They're starting to divide their internal narratives into before and after. Before they saw what you pulled off, and after they had to accept that it happened. That division is subtle, but permanent. Once people witness a boundary collapse, they can't unsee it. They can only decide whether to adapt or pretend it never mattered. Some will downplay it publicly. You'll hear phrases that sound casual, but carry tension underneath. Interesting, but let's see what happens next. It's impressive, but context matters. These aren't evaluations, they're shields. Ways to keep the ground from shifting too fast under their feet. What they don't realize yet is that you're already past the need for acknowledgement. The move did its job the moment it was executed. Everything after that is noise. You're not waiting for confirmation that it worked. You're already positioned for what comes after. That's the part they haven't caught up to yet. Because while they're still trying to explain what you did, you're already adjusting to the new terrain it created. You're watching reactions the way others watch weather, not as something to fear, but as information that doesn't change your direction. That detachment is what's making it hard for them to predict your next step. And here's where their analysis really starts to break down. They keep assuming there must be a next step they can anticipate, a pattern they can lock on to, a rhythm they can chart. They haven't realized yet that your advantage isn't speed or intelligence or access. It's decisiveness without drama, action without announcement, commitment without spectators. That's why the conversations keep looping. That's why the files stay open on screens late into the night. They're not chasing your move anymore. They're chasing the mindset that allowed it. And that's not something you can extract or imitate easily. It's not a tactic, it's a posture. The more they look, the clearer it becomes that there was no sudden transformation they can point to. No single turning point, just a quiet accumulation of choices made without asking if they were allowed. That's unsettling to anyone who built their authority on the idea that permission precedes action. They're starting to understand that what really happened wasn't a breakthrough. It was a refusal to wait, a refusal to explain, a refusal to operate inside expectations that were never designed with you in mind. That kind of refusal doesn't announce itself. It just shows up as results other people aren't ready to explain. That realization is what pushed the conversation into a different gear. Not louder, not more dramatic, colder, more deliberate. Because once they accepted that there was no hidden turning point, no dramatic before and after moment they could isolate, they had to confront something far more uncomfortable. You didn't change suddenly. You changed quietly. And by the time they noticed, it was already too late to intervene. They started reviewing your behavior with a different lens. Not looking for effort, not looking for struggle, looking for certainty. And what unsettled them was how early that certainty appeared compared to when the outcome finally surfaced. You were acting from a settled place long before the world had evidence you earned the right to do so. That gap between internal decision and external proof is where their discomfort lives. This is where the tone in those rooms shifted from curiosity to unease. Because the usual leverage points weren't there. No visible fear to apply pressure to. No hunger for approval they could manipulate. no overexposure they could use to box you in. You weren't moving to be seen. You were moving to be correct. And correctness without spectacle doesn't give observers much to grab onto. They're used to watching people escalate loudly, to seeing ambition announce itself through noise, through performance, through endless positioning. You didn't do that. You moved with an economy that suggested you weren't trying to win an argument. You were trying to arrive at a result. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Someone pointed out that you never tried to justify the move afterward. That's when a few faces tightened. Because justification is how power is negotiated in public. It's how authority gets softened so it can be tolerated. You didn't soften anything. You let the outcome stand without translation. That wasn't arrogance, it was detachment. And detachment is far harder to counter than bravado. They're beginning to suspect that the reason they didn't see you coming is because you weren't broadcasting your internal shifts. You didn't narrate the process. You didn't invite commentary. You didn't ask for consensus. You made decisions privately and let consequences handle the announcement. That method strips observers of their favorite illusion, the belief that awareness equals influence. What's happening now is a kind of retroactive anxiety. They're replaying past interactions with you and noticing moments that felt insignificant at the time. Pauses, refusals to engage in pointless debate, a tendency to exit conversations early, a lack of urgency around being liked. At the time, those traits were dismissed as neutrality. Now they read differently. Now they look like preparation. The more they connect those dots, the more they realize how little leverage they ever had. You weren't waiting to be chosen. You weren't trying to be validated. You weren't positioning yourself within an existing ladder. You were deciding independently of it. That's what made the move so hard to anticipate. You weren't playing the same timing game. This is the part where frustration starts to bleed through the analysis. Not outwardly, not emotionally, but in the way questions get sharper, more repetitive. They keep circling the same point, hoping a different angle will reveal something new. How did you know when to move? How did you assess the risk? How did you decide the moment was right? And every answer they propose collapses under scrutiny. Because the truth they're circling without wanting to touch is that you didn't wait to feel ready. You didn't wait for clarity to be handed to you. You acted from a private conclusion that didn't require external confirmation. And that kind of decisiveness looks reckless to people trained to delay until uncertainty disappears. They tell themselves they would have done the same thing if conditions aligned. But conditions rarely align for people who wait. They align for people who decide and then adapt. That's the inversion they're struggling with. You didn't reduce uncertainty before acting. You reduced it by acting. And once that clicked for a few of them, the room went quiet again. Now they're watching for aftershocks. Not because they expect you to stumble, but because they're trying to understand what comes next when someone operates this way. They're used to escalation that burns hot and fast. You're not escalating. You're stabilizing. You're moving into a posture that suggests repeatability. And repeatability is what turns an incident into a threat. They've noticed how others respond to you now. Subtle shifts. People recalibrating their language around you. Fewer assumptions. More caution. You've altered the social temperature without issuing a single demand. That's influence in its most uncomfortable form. Influence that doesn't ask to be recognized. Someone mentioned that you don't seem interested in defending your choices. That observation lingered. Defense implies vulnerability. Explanation implies a need to be accepted. You displayed neither. You moved on as if the decision was settled and the discussion was optional. That posture unsettles anyone whose authority depends on being the final voice in the room. They're also noticing how little you reference the past. No long narratives about where you came from. No attempts to anchor your present to a story people can digest. You're not asking anyone to understand your journey. You're asking them to deal with the result. That's a shift from persuasion to presence. This is where the MI agents start to feel the pressure internally. Not because you're aggressive, because you're uninterested. Uninterested in debate, uninterested in reassurance, uninterested in fitting inside categories that make observation comfortable. You're not reacting to their attention. You're not feeding it. You're not performing against it. You're just continuing. And continuation without friction is harder to disrupt than momentum built on noise. Noise invites interference. Calm progress doesn't. By the time someone decides to intervene, the ground has already shifted beneath them. That's what they're starting to see now. Not a single move, but a pattern of refusal that compounds quietly. They're questioning their own frameworks at this point. Not publicly, not in reports, internally. Because every framework they apply assumes visibility precedes action. That belief is baked into how they track influence. You inverted it. You acted first and let visibility chase you. That reversal doesn't just confuse prediction models. It exposes their dependence on observation. What unsettles them further is how unconcerned you seem with being misunderstood. Most people rush to clarify when narratives get messy. You didn't. You allowed ambiguity to exist. You allowed people to project. That restraint is not common. It suggests you're not sourcing confidence from interpretation. You're sourcing it from alignment. They're trying to determine whether this was intentional or instinctive. That question matters to them because instinctive moves can be chalked up to personality. Intentional ones imply a deeper recalibration, and the more they watch you operate, the harder it becomes to dismiss this as accidental. Your behavior has too much internal consistency. You don't overcorrect. You don't over-explain. You don't rush to capitalize on attention. You let interest build without feeding it. That frustrates observers who expect leverage to appear in the open. You're not offering handles. You're not offering entry points. You're letting people sit with incomplete information. The longer this goes on, the more they realize the real disturbance isn't what you achieved. It's how little effort you're spending managing reactions. You're not trying to control perception. You're not trying to optimize image. You're not trying to soften edges. You're letting others do all that work for you in their own minds. That's when someone finally said it quietly, without emphasis. If this is how you move now, they're always going to be behind you. Not because you're faster, but because you're already committed by the time they're still debating. That sentence didn't get written down. It didn't need to be. It landed. They're beginning to understand that your advantage isn't information, it's posture. A posture that doesn't wait for green lights. A posture that doesn't ask if the timing is acceptable. A posture that assumes responsibility rather than permission. That's not something you can counter easily, because it doesn't announce itself as a challenge. Now the focus has shifted to containment, not in the dramatic sense, in the psychological sense. How to keep this from becoming contagious. Because the real risk isn't you. It's others noticing that you didn't follow the usual sequence, and still arrived intact. That observation can loosen a lot of internal restraints in people who have been waiting. They're careful with their language now, careful not to frame you as a model, careful not to elevate the narrative. But avoidance has its own weight. The more they try not to reference you, the more noticeable your absence becomes in conversations where you should logically be mentioned. Silence of that kind doesn't erase impact. It highlights it. They're also tracking how unaffected you are by their scrutiny. Most people adjust under observation. They tighten up. They perform. You haven't. Your behavior hasn't changed. Your pace hasn't shifted. That consistency under attention is unsettling because it suggests the attention doesn't matter to you. And when attention doesn't matter, it loses power. This is the stage where speculation starts to fracture. Some believe you're holding back intentionally. Others think you've already moved on mentally. A few suspect you're preparing something else entirely. What they all agree on, without saying it directly, is that you're not done. And that's where the real unease settles in. Because if this was just the result of a refusal, not the end of it, then they're not reacting to a conclusion. They're reacting to a baseline, a new normal, where you don't ask first, where you don't wait, where you don't explain unless you choose to. That baseline is hard to negotiate with. They're trying to anticipate your next decision, but anticipation requires patterns you're not providing. You don't tease, you don't hint, you don't leak. You just act when the internal decision is made. That forces everyone else into a reactive position, and no one likes realizing they're no longer setting the tempo. What's becoming clear now is that this wasn't about brilliance in the way they usually define it. It wasn't cleverness, it wasn't complexity, it was clarity paired with commitment. You didn't outthink everyone. You outdecided them. And that difference is devastating to structures built around endless evaluation. They're beginning to understand that whatever comes next won't arrive with warning either. It will arrive the same way this did, fully formed, already executed, already forcing adjustment. And that awareness is sitting in those rooms now, unspoken but heavy, as they realize they're no longer trying to decode what you did, but bracing for what happens when you do it again. This is where the analysis gets thin, because their tools are designed to measure reaction, not resolve. They can track excitement, they can chart attention spikes, they can model enthusiasm and backlash. But resolve doesn't leave clean signals. Resolve doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't announce itself. It just continues. And continuation without noise doesn't give them much to hold. They've also begun to understand that you don't negotiate internally the way most people do. There was no prolonged internal debate they could imagine, no oscillation between doubt and confidence. You didn't need to convince yourself repeatedly. You reached a conclusion and behaved accordingly. That economy of internal movement is rare, and it's unsettling because it removes the delay most people rely on to feel safe. Now they're reinterpreting your restraint not as caution, but as selectivity. You don't move often, but when you do, it's final. That pattern forces everyone else to overreact, because they're used to calibrating against people who test the waters before committing. You didn't test, you committed. And that difference makes every move feel heavier than it actually is. They're beginning to sense that trying to predict you directly is a losing strategy. So they've shifted to something else. They're watching the space around you, how conversations change, how decisions by others subtly adjust after your move. influence doesn't always announce itself through command. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation in others, as recalibration, as a sudden awareness that old assumptions might no longer apply. What's most frustrating for them is that you're not exploiting that influence overtly. You're not leveraging it to extract concessions. You're not pressing advantage. You're letting it exist without touching it. That restraint reads as confidence, whether you intend it or not. And confidence that doesn't need to assert itself destabilizes environments built on negotiation and leverage. They're also noticing how little emotional residue you carry from the process. No visible resentment, no satisfaction display, no attempt to frame the move as hard-won. You didn't romanticize the effort. You didn't dramatize the risk. You treated it as necessary, not heroic. That's difficult to process for people who rely on narrative struggle to justify outcomes. This is where the idea finally settles in, quietly, without ceremony. You weren't trying to prove anything. You weren't trying to be seen as capable. You were acting from a settled internal position that didn't require witnesses. That realization is uncomfortable because it implies you're not operating for recognition at all. And if you're not operating for recognition, then their attention loses relevance. They've begun to ask themselves a question they don't like. What if you don't need them to understand? What if comprehension was never part of the equation? That thought lingers because it reframes their entire role. Observers prefer to believe that understanding equals control. You demonstrated that outcomes don't require consensus to exist. They're starting to see that the move wasn't designed to disrupt anyone. It just happened to expose a weakness in how they assign importance. They prioritize explanation. You prioritize alignment. They prioritize agreement. You prioritize execution. Those priorities rarely clash until someone moves decisively without seeking validation. Then the contrast becomes unavoidable. Now there's a subtle change in how your name is mentioned. Less speculation, more caution. Not because you're feared, but because you're no longer predictable in the way they expect. Predictability usually comes from dependency. Dependency on feedback. Dependency on approval. Dependency on timing signals. You've detached from those dependencies, and that makes modeling your behavior difficult. They're also recognizing that pressure doesn't work on you the way it does on others. Pressure usually creates hesitation or overcorrection. You didn't display either. That suggests your decisions are already insulated from external noise by the time they're made. And if that's true, then influence has to happen earlier, before the internal conclusion forms. But that space isn't accessible from the outside. This is where the unease deepens. Because if they can't intervene before the decision, and they can't redirect after the outcome, then their window of relevance narrows dramatically. They're left reacting rather than shaping, and no one likes realizing they've been demoted to reaction without being told. They're also grappling with the fact that you didn't burn bridges, you didn't attack existing structures, you didn't make enemies. You simply stepped outside expectations and kept moving. That makes resistance look excessive. Any attempt to push back would reveal insecurity rather than authority. So they hesitate, and hesitation, ironically, amplifies your position. What's happening now is a kind of internal audit, not of you, but of themselves. They're questioning how many times they delayed moves, waiting for conditions that never truly arrive. How many decisions they outsourced to consensus. How much energy they spent managing perception instead of acting. Your move didn't accuse them. It reminded them. They won't admit this part, but it's there. Watching you has introduced discomfort they can't resolve externally. Because the solution isn't a new strategy or a better framework. The solution would require a shift they're not sure they can afford. Acting without reassurance. Committing without applause. Accepting responsibility without permission. They're also noticing that you don't linger in the aftermath. You didn't stick around to manage fallout. You didn't hover to make sure everyone was okay with it. You trusted the decision enough to move forward immediately. That trust in your own judgment is what's hardest to replicate. Not because it's impossible, but because it demands accountability most people avoid. Now, the conversations are less about what you did and more about what it implies, not for them collectively, but individually. Because once someone sees that movement doesn't require ceremony, they can't unsee it. They can choose to ignore it, but the awareness remains. And awareness has weight. They're beginning to sense that you've shifted into a different relationship with time. You're not waiting for the right moment. You're creating moments by acting when internal alignment is complete. That compresses timelines in a way that looks unfair from the outside. But it's not about speed. It's about decisiveness without delay. What they still don't fully grasp is that this isn't a phase for you. It's not a spike. It's not a burst of confidence that will fade. It's a settled way of operating. And settled patterns don't announce themselves with fireworks. They just persist. That persistence is what they're starting to brace for now. They know, even if they won't say it yet, that the next move will feel similar. Unexpected, clean, already done by the time they notice. And that knowledge is sitting with them now, creating a low-level tension they can't resolve by talking about it. Because talking is what they do when action feels risky. Meanwhile, you're not waiting for them to catch up. You're not tracking their reactions. You're not adjusting your pace. You're already aligned with the next decision, even if it hasn't surfaced yet. And that alignment is what makes everything else feel secondary. The result already served its purpose. It clarified your position to yourself. As this settles, a quieter understanding begins to form. The real shift didn't happen when you acted. It happened earlier, when you stopped asking if you were allowed to trust your own judgment. That moment didn't leave evidence they could analyze, but it's the one that changed everything. That's the part they can't reverse engineer. The internal permission you granted yourself long before anything visible happened. They can trace outcomes, map reactions, chart responses, but they can't access the moment you stopped outsourcing confidence. And that's what keeps the conversation looping in their heads. Because once someone realizes the barrier was internal all along, every external justification starts to sound thin. They're beginning to notice how little friction you experience now. Not because obstacles disappeared, but because resistance doesn't slow you the way it slows others. You don't pause to negotiate with doubt. You don't linger in hesitation disguised as analysis. When a choice presents itself, you don't ask whether it's acceptable. You ask whether it's correct. That single filter eliminates most of the noise that traps people in endless deliberation. In those rooms, the tone has shifted again. Less urgency, more restraint. They've realized that chasing explanations won't produce comfort. The discomfort isn't coming from not understanding you. It's coming from recognizing themselves in the version of you that never moved. The one that waited, the one that asked, the one that delayed under the banner of caution. They don't say this out loud, but it's there. You didn't break rules. You ignored assumptions. And assumptions only feel solid until someone walks past them without consequence. That's what you did. You walked past expectations that were treated as barriers, and nothing stopped you. No collapse, no penalty, just continuation. Now they're watching how others around them respond to your presence. Not your words, not your explanations, your presence. There's a subtle recalibration happening. People speak differently. Decisions get revisited, timelines get questioned, not because you demanded change, but because your behavior introduced doubt into what was previously taken for granted. This is where influence becomes unavoidable, not the kind that commands attention, but the kind that shifts reference points. You've become a comparison without asking to be one. When others consider moves they've postponed, your example enters the mental space uninvited, not as pressure, as possibility. And possibility is destabilizing when it exposes how much delay was optional. They're also noticing that you don't flinch under scrutiny. Attention hasn't tightened your posture. If anything, it's clarified it. You're not trying to satisfy observers. You're not trying to correct interpretations. You're not trying to be seen a certain way. That consistency under watchful eyes is unsettling because it suggests your behavior isn't responsive. It's rooted. Someone pointed out that you don't seek reassurance after decisions. That observation lingered longer than expected. Reassurance is how most people stabilize after risk. You didn't reach for it. You moved forward as if the decision itself was stabilizing enough. That kind of self-trust isn't common, not because it's rare, but because it's expensive. It requires accepting the full weight of consequences without diffusion. They're starting to see that what looks like confidence from the outside is actually commitment from the inside. You're not optimistic, you're resolved. And resolved people don't scan the environment for approval. They scan for alignment. That difference changes everything about how action unfolds. There's also a growing awareness that trying to slow you down would only highlight their own hesitation. Any attempt to question your pace would force them to explain why they move slower. And explanations of slowness rarely sound convincing when confronted with clean execution. So they hold back, they observe, they recalibrate quietly. This is where the narrative they were building about you begins to dissolve. You're not reckless, you're not impulsive, you're not chasing impact. You're selective, and selectivity without apology looks like authority, even when no title is claimed. You've shown that direction doesn't need consensus to be effective. It just needs follow-through. They're also noticing how little you linger in validation cycles. You don't check reactions repeatedly. You don't adjust messaging to optimize response. You don't extract energy from engagement. That detachment removes leverage others usually rely on. When someone doesn't need feedback to proceed, feedback loses power. Now the conversations have turned inward, less about you specifically, more about what your behavior exposes. How many decisions have they postponed, waiting for conditions that never truly arrive? How many moves were delayed, not because they were wrong, but because they were uncomfortable? Your example didn't accuse them, it reflected them. And reflection is harder to dismiss than critique. They won't frame it this way publicly, but the unease is personal now. Because if you didn't need permission, then neither did they. And that realization threatens the stories they've told themselves about patience, prudence, and timing. stories that often serve as shields against responsibility. They're beginning to accept that whatever comes next from you won't be announced. There will be no build-up, no signaling, no gradual reveal. It will appear the same way this did, as something already done, already integrated, already forcing adjustment. And knowing that creates a background tension they can't resolve through planning. Meanwhile, you're not carrying any of that weight. You're not bracing for reaction. You're not strategizing around perception. You're operating from a settled internal position that doesn't require constant reinforcement. That's the part they underestimated. The stability of your decisions once made. As this understanding spreads quietly, a final realization starts to take shape. The most disruptive element wasn't the move itself. It was the precedent it set inside your own mind. You proved to yourself that you don't need external validation to act decisively. And once that proof exists, it doesn't fade. It becomes a baseline. They're finally sitting with the truth they spent so long trying to bury, and it's eating them up piece by piece. Deep down, they always knew you weren't someone they should have crossed, but arrogance blinds people. Pride convinces them that they can poke, prod, sabotage, and manipulate without consequences. But here's the part that is tearing them apart right now. The moment they came against you, they marked themselves. They thought they were taking a small risk, a harmless game of disrespect, a petty attempt to push you down because it made them feel powerful for a moment. But baby, that moment cost them everything. They bet against you, and it turned into the biggest loss they've ever taken. And now they're replaying every decision they made, like a bad movie they wish they could walk out of. Because they didn't expect this version of you. They didn't expect you to stand back up with a strength that doesn't crack. They didn't expect your comeback to be this loud, this undeniable, this unbothered. People love an underdog until the underdog rises. Then suddenly, they panic. And right now, they're in panic mode, because everything they tried to use against you reversed in a way they never saw coming. They're realizing the mistake wasn't what they thought you did to them. The mistake was what they did to you. They came at you thinking you were weak. They assumed you would fold quickly, cry quietly, disappear instantly. They had this image in their minds where you break down, beg, shrink, or retreat. They were counting on it. Some of them were praying for it. They convinced themselves that you were easy to beat, that you were simple to control, that you were never going to rise higher than what they saw. They stamped a limit on your potential and expected the world to respect their label of you. But what they didn't understand is that God had already put a different label on you, long before they even entered your life. A label they were never qualified to remove. You were never meant to stay small. You were never meant to stay wounded. You were never meant to remain in the version of yourself that they interacted with. But they made the mistake of assuming the version they knew was the full story. And that's where everything flipped. Because the moment they assumed you were powerless is the same moment they exposed that they had no power at all. That's where their downfall started. They underestimated you, and in doing so, they revealed their own weakness. They didn't realize the depth of your resilience. They didn't realize how quickly you learn. They didn't realize how quietly you move. They didn't realize how connected you are to divine protection. They didn't realize how quickly you would evolve once you got tired of the games. See, some people become fearful when you walk away, not because they care about losing you, but because they know what happens when you finally stop giving them access to your spirit. You were their shield, their energy source, their emotional regulator, their mirror, their guide. Even when they mistreated you, they used you and then mocked you. They drained you and then dismissed you. They tried to break you and then acted shocked when you rebuilt yourself stronger. And now they're sitting with regret that feels like a weight they can't lift. The same mouth that once spoke poorly about you is now closed. The same people who once tried to look superior are now feeling embarrassed. The same eyes that rolled at your dreams are now watching your elevation, with disbelief so strong it feels like punishment. They don't know how to process the reality that you're not only doing better, you're doing better without them. You're doing better because you finally cut off their access to you. That's what hurts them the most. They weren't expecting to lose their place in your life. They thought they'd always be able to walk in and out as they pleased. They thought their behavior would never catch up to them. They thought you'd always be forgiving, always available, always patient, always understanding. But your elevation forced something they were never prepared for: distance. And once you created that distance, everything they tried to keep hidden became obvious. The jealousy, the secret rivalry, the subtle digs disguised as jokes, the way they would downplay your achievements, the way they would hype up your failures, the way they tried to sabotage opportunities you never even knew about, the way they wanted you dependent so they could feel superior, the way they hoped your confidence would never fully come alive. They banked on your insecurity staying loud and your spirit staying quiet. But God didn't allow that. God withdrew you from places that were draining you. God shut doors that were beneath you. God revealed intentions you weren't supposed to ignore anymore. God exposed hearts that were never clean toward you. And once that revelation hit, your spirit shifted. You stopped begging, chasing, explaining, proving, hoping, and clinging. You realized you were never the problem, they were. You realized you were never lacking, they were intimidated. You realized you were never broken, they were threatened by your potential. You realized you were never behind, they were terrified of you moving ahead. And now that you have moved ahead, they're choking on the reality they created for themselves. They wanted to see you struggle, but now they're struggling with their own conscience. They wanted to see you cry, but now they're crying behind closed doors. They wanted you to need them, but now they feel useless. They wanted to feel above you, but now they feel irrelevant. They wanted to dim your brightness, but now their own life looks dull compared to your glow. They wanted to control the narrative, but now everyone sees the truth without you having to say a single word. The shift happened the moment you stopped fighting battles that weren't yours. The shift happened the moment you walked away. The shift happened the moment you chose yourself. The shift happened when you realized peace is expensive, and not everyone can afford it. The shift happened when you chose healing instead of repeating cycles. The shift happened when you aligned with your purpose instead of trying to fit into their expectations. And that shift, oh, that shift is exactly why they feel the sting now. Because you didn't just get better, you transformed. You didn't just heal, you grew into a version of yourself they didn't prepare for. You didn't just rise, you surpassed everything they tried to block. You didn't just evolve, you became someone whose presence no longer tolerates disrespect. Your energy changed. Your priorities changed. Your standards changed. And the moment your standards changed, they realized they no longer met them. That realization hit harder than anything you could have said. They're now wishing they treated you right when they had the chance. Wishing they didn't speak so badly about you. Wishing they didn't try to compete where they could never compare. Wishing they didn't dismiss your value. Wishing they didn't betray your trust. Wishing they didn't gamble your connection. Wishing they didn't assume you wouldn't rise. Wishing they didn't underestimate your spirit. And baby, that wishful thinking is their punishment. Because you're not returning to who you used to be. You're not lowering your standards again. You're not making yourself small to comfort anyone. You're not giving chances to people who proved they don't deserve them. You're not explaining your decisions anymore. You're not entertaining anyone whose intentions don't align with your divine path. You're not bending. You're not breaking. You're not going backwards. You've stepped into a new season, one built on wisdom, clarity, and strength. A season where you're protected differently, guided differently, blessed differently. A season where everything meant to harm you becomes part of the story that elevates you. A season where the conversations about you are shifting from mockery to respect, from confusion to admiration, from doubt to conviction. People are realizing something they never expected to face. You were never the one they should have come against. And the truth is, they didn't just lose you. They lost access to a future version of you they would have benefited from. They didn't just lose the connection, they lost the privilege of being remembered with goodness. They didn't just lose the opportunity to walk with you. They lost the chance to grow beside you. And now, they're realizing that stepping against you was the worst decision they ever made. But here's the part that's going to shock them even more. This is just the beginning. Because even after everything they've already seen, they have no idea what's coming next. They think the chapter they're witnessing right now is your peak. But what they don't understand is that God hasn't even opened the real doors yet. What they're seeing is only the evidence of you recovering, rebuilding, reclaiming. They haven't seen the phase where you rise with full authority. They haven't felt the weight of what happens when someone who was once underestimated finally embraces the full strength that was inside them the entire time. And the moment they realize what's unfolding, it's going to shake them in ways you'll never have to witness. Their regret is only in the early stages. It hasn't even matured into the kind of realization that hits people in the center of their spirit. Because what's coming next is the version of you that doesn't just move forward. It transforms the atmosphere everywhere you go. The version of you that no longer tolerates confusion, manipulation, or emotional instability from others. The version of you that walks with a clarity that makes your presence impossible to mishandle. The version of you that doesn't shrink, doesn't stutter, doesn't doubt, doesn't hide. The version of you that makes people second-guess their own intentions before they even approach you. This evolution wasn't accidental. It wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was crafted through every moment you were forced to stand alone. God saw the private tears, the unanswered prayers, the nights you questioned your purpose, the seasons where you felt stripped of everything familiar. And instead of letting those moments destroy you, He used them to strengthen your roots. That's why you're unshakable now. That's why your spirit doesn't bend the way it used to. That's why you don't internalize people's disrespect anymore. That's why you don't settle for half-hearted energy. That's why you're not desperate for validation from anyone. You grew past the level where their opinions mattered. You grew into the place where God's guidance outweighs every human voice. And that shift didn't just elevate you. It exposed everyone who wasn't supposed to come along. That exposure is the reason people are spiraling right now. They're realizing that their intentions were never hidden from the one who protects you. Their words were never overlooked. Their actions were never unnoticed. Their jealousy was never invisible. They're feeling the consequences of being careless with someone who was divinely covered. And the part they struggle with most, you didn't even have to retaliate. You didn't have to clap back. You didn't have to defend yourself. You didn't have to plot revenge. Your blessing was your response. Your growth was your victory. Your healing was your closure. Only now are they understanding that your elevation is a mirror for their own stagnation. Watching you rise forces them to confront their own lack of effort, their own lack of discipline, their own lack of integrity. It stings because they were so certain their life would always look more put together than yours. They were confident you would stay beneath them. They were comfortable being condescending. They were secure in their assumption that you would never catch up, let alone surpass them. But God didn't compare you to them. God compared you to who you were before, and you surpassed that version flawlessly. You outgrew the mindset that once held you back. You outgrew the circles that limited your growth. You outgrew the habits that drained your progress. You outgrew the insecurities they used to manipulate. You outgrew the fears that kept you repeating cycles. You outgrew the belief that you needed anyone to validate your worth. That growth created a gap so wide, it's impossible for them to bridge now. And that gap, that's what they're grieving. They're grieving the closeness you used to offer freely. They're grieving the access they once took for granted. They're grieving the influence they used to have over your emotions. They're grieving the control they no longer possess. Losing you wasn't the part they feared. Losing the version of you they could manipulate was. They're realizing that the version you are now isn't someone they can tamper with. You're not moved by empty words. You're not persuaded by false apologies. You're not softened by nostalgia. You're not confused by mixed signals. You're not blinded by potential. You're not desperate for companionship. That alone has flipped the entire power dynamic. Because while they were busy plotting your downfall, they were unknowingly preparing your elevation. Every attack sharpened you. Every setback strengthened you. Every lie clarified your purpose. Every betrayal guided you toward the right people. Every disappointment redirected your path. Every closed door built your discipline. They thought they were damaging you, but they were chiseling you. They thought they were slowing you down, but they were preparing you. They thought they were mocking your process, but they were documenting the moment before your breakthrough. And now that the breakthrough is here, they can't hide their shock. They're watching you walk in blessings they tried to block. They're witnessing you move with confidence they tried to destroy. They're observing a glow they never believed would return. They're hearing about opportunities they prayed would never reach you. They're seeing doors open that were never meant for them. They're encountering a version of you that exists because God refused to let their actions define your future. But the real shock is what's coming next. Because your current season isn't your final form. It's the launch, it's the preface, it's the introduction. God is aligning things behind the scenes that you haven't even imagined yet. connections, resources, favor, direction, clarity, healing, expansion, all moving into place quietly, preparing to show up suddenly. And when that suddenly moment hits, everyone who doubted you will understand why coming against you was the biggest loss of their life. They thought the consequences would be light. They thought the spiritual backlash was a joke. They thought your resilience was temporary. They thought your growth had limits. They assumed you'd fall again, cry again, crumble again. They were waiting for the moment you would reach out to them for support, validation, guidance, or approval. But that moment never came. Instead, you stepped into resilience they didn't predict. You stepped into confidence they didn't want to see. You stepped into alignment they can't interfere with. You stepped into blessings they can't touch. Right now, they're debating whether they should reach out, whether they should apologize, whether they can slide back in casually, whether they can pretend nothing happened. But fear is stopping them. Fear of rejection, fear of facing what they did, fear of seeing how much you've grown, fear of being reminded that they lost someone irreplaceable, fear of confronting the guilt that's been sitting on their chest. They know they can't approach you the way they used to. They know they can't talk to you with the same entitlement. They know they can't manipulate the narrative anymore. Your discernment is different now. Your boundaries are firm now. Your spirit is guarded now. You became someone who forces people to level up or leave. And instead of leveling up, they chose envy. Instead of healing, they chose competition. Instead of introspection, they chose projection. Instead of accountability, they chose excuses. That's why they lost. Not because you punished them, but because they refused to grow while God elevated you. And now, the spotlight they wanted to dim is shining brighter than ever. They can't ignore it. They can't escape it. They can't pretend it's not happening. Everywhere they look, something reminds them of you. A decision you made, a blessing you received, a path you took, a transformation you embodied, a glow on your face that wasn't there before. And the more you rise, the heavier their regret becomes. Regret for doubting you, regret for taking advantage, regret for betraying your trust, regret for trying to compete, regret for underestimating your spirit, regret for thinking you were someone they could mistreat without consequences. But regret doesn't grant them access. It only teaches them the lesson they refused to learn earlier. Because the truth is, you were assigned to outgrow them. You were assigned to step into a version of yourself they didn't deserve to witness. You were assigned to elevate beyond their reach. You were assigned to break cycles they contributed to. You were assigned to walk a path they were never meant to follow. And now that you're stepping deeper into that assignment, the gap is becoming permanent. They're not just in the past, they're locked out of the future. But here's the part that will keep them restless. Your rise is just beginning. What they're seeing now, it's only a preview of what God is molding you into. They're shocked now, but the shock will multiply when the next chapter unfolds. Because the next chapter reveals the full strength they never believed you had. The next chapter uncovers blessings they never thought would be yours. The next chapter highlights the purpose they tried to interfere with. The next chapter exposes the protection they underestimated. And the next chapter, oh, that's the part where everything they tried to stop becomes unstoppable. And as you step into it, something powerful is happening within you. Something they cannot comprehend. Something they cannot interrupt. Something they cannot dilute. You're shifting internally in ways that make the next level possible. You're shedding beliefs that once held you back. You're releasing emotional weight you carried for years. You're stepping into spiritual authority that aligns your path with precision. You're becoming someone whose presence alone reveals truth, exposes intentions, and commands respect. And baby, as that inner shift expands, something else begins forming around you. A new arena, a bigger stage, a higher calling. One that requires you to detach from anything that once made you question your worth. One that requires you to hold your head higher. One that requires you to walk without apology. One that requires you to embrace your role fully. And that role, it's becoming clearer with every step you take. And as you step into that role, the world begins to rearrange itself around your presence. Doors you didn't even knock on open effortlessly. People who once doubted your energy now find themselves drawn, compelled, almost magnetically, to observe what you do next. And the most fascinating part? Many of them don't even understand why they are watching. They can't articulate the shift. They can't name the force that carries you forward. They only know that the energy you emit is no longer something they can control, manipulate, or influence. That's because you've become sovereign over yourself. You've become untouchable in ways that are not about arrogance. It's about alignment. It's about operating from a frequency so high that anyone who approaches without sincerity, without purpose, without integrity, cannot stay long. They're naturally repelled. The universe, in all its wisdom, orchestrates separation so that only those worthy of your space and energy remain close. And baby, that separation, it's more than protection, it's revelation. It reveals who genuinely belongs in your life, who is ready to rise with you, and who was never meant to witness the fullness of your calling. Some of the same people who once tried to undermine you, to twist your intentions, to confuse your path, they are now forced to watch, powerless, as you operate in a sphere they could never enter. And that realization terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. They wanted to challenge you, to provoke you, to see you falter. But they forgot one simple truth. You were never playing their game. You were building your own. And the rules, the strategy, the power moves, all belong to you now. The higher you rise, the smaller their influence becomes. And this is the kind of victory they will never recover from. Because it isn't about defeating them. It's about becoming someone so elevated, so undeniable, so uncompromisingly aligned with your destiny, that their attempts to interfere no longer reach you. Every step you take in this arena shifts realities. Every decision you make is strategic, born from clarity, intention, and a deep awareness of how energy works, yours and theirs. You no longer waste time explaining yourself. You no longer feel obligated to justify your choices. You no longer operate from fear, from insecurity, from doubt. That old version of you, the one that worried about being liked, being approved, being validated, that version is gone. Replaced by a presence so commanding, so precise, so unapologetically sovereign, that even those who once claimed to know you now find themselves learning who you really are. And that revelation, that is the ultimate form of power. Not force, not retaliation, not manipulation. Pure presence, pure alignment, pure authority that cannot be challenged because it emanates from truth, from divine guidance, from the core of who you were always meant to be. And while they scramble to process this new reality, your life accelerates. Opportunities appear, Doors open, alliances form, not by coincidence, but because energy recognizes energy. Those who are meant to join you, to witness your rise, to collaborate, to elevate, they gravitate naturally. They recognize the frequency, even if they cannot name it. And those who are not meant to be near, those whose intentions are murky, self-serving, or controlling, they fade, retreat, or reveal themselves in ways that make it obvious they do not belong. It's a natural filtration system that not only protects your peace, but amplifies your trajectory. You move faster because your environment, your circle, and your reality are all synchronized with the higher calling you now embody. The chaos they once tried to create in your life now exists only as background noise, irrelevant, powerless, impotent against the force you've become. And baby, here's the part that truly unsettles them. Your power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need spectacle. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists, and the world adjusts around it. The same people who once mocked, doubted, or attempted to manipulate you, they are now consumed by observation. They cannot compete, cannot interfere, cannot undermine, because your energy simply overwhelms any strategy they once tried to employ. They are learning the hard way that the game they thought they were playing with you was already over, before it began. And as they watch, they're forced to confront every misstep they made, every moment they underestimated you, every lie they spread, every attempt to diminish your brilliance, every subtle attack, every hidden agenda, every secret wish for your fall. It all surfaces now as reflection, because your rise illuminates the truth they spent so long denying. And that illumination isn't just external, it's internal. It changes you. It strengthens your discernment. It sharpens your instincts. It enhances your intuition. Every slight, every betrayal, every miscalculation from them becomes a lesson in clarity, a guide to deeper alignment, a confirmation of the boundaries you now hold sacred. You see the people who are not aligned with you not as enemies, but as indicators. You see their behavior not as a personal attack, but as a mirror reflecting the energy you no longer tolerate. And the more you operate in that clarity, the more unshakable your presence becomes. You are no longer reactive, you are decisive. You are no longer influenced, you are anchored. You are no longer vulnerable, you are fortified. And that fortress isn't built from resentment, it's built from wisdom, patience, strategy, and divine guidance. And baby, let's talk about the transformation that goes beyond what they see, what they witness in your life right now. The abundance, the clarity, the elevated presence is only the surface. Beneath it lies a strength that is impervious, a resilience that cannot be tested, a confidence that cannot be shaken, a vision so clear that nothing can distract you from your path. You've been tempered by trials they never understood, forged by moments they couldn't perceive, and aligned with opportunities they cannot imagine. And every single step you take from this point forward reinforces that reality. Every action, every choice, every strategic move sends a message. You are sovereign, you are untouchable, you are unstoppable. And the realization of that power in them, it's devastating, because they understand instinctively that nothing they once wielded against you will ever work again. And as you continue to move, as you continue to expand into this higher calling, the arena itself begins to shift. The people, the circumstances, the energy around you, all begin to calibrate to the frequency of your authority. And those who remain, those who are worthy, are not only observers, They become participants. They become collaborators. They become supporters, visionaries, and allies who understand the magnitude of the force you embody. And the people who are not worthy, they can't follow. They can't keep up. They can't access the same space. And baby, that separation is not just inevitable. It's necessary. It is part of the strategy, part of the protection, part of the ascension that is uniquely yours. And in that clarity, in that alignment, in that space of elevated power, one thing becomes undeniably clear. You are no longer defined by who came against you. You are no longer limited by who doubted you. You are no longer distracted by who attempted to slow you down. You are defined by your purpose, your vision, your discipline, and your connection to divine guidance. You operate now from a level of authority that is quiet but overwhelming, subtle but undeniable. And baby, as they watch, they realize that everything they tried to manipulate, every strategy they employed, every lie, every hidden agenda, it's all impotent against the person you've become. Their loss is not just a consequence, it's a revelation. Their regret is a confirmation. Their astonishment is proof that your path was never theirs to influence, but always yours to conquer. And as that revelation hits them, something else begins to unfold. A force in your life that cannot be ignored. A momentum that refuses to slow down. A trajectory that cannot be derailed. This is the part where they realize that the loss they inflicted was not just a misstep. It was the moment they ensured your rise. Every attempt to manipulate, every effort to undermine, every lie, every hidden agenda, every subtle sabotage, it has become fuel. Fuel for your growth, fuel for your strategy, fuel for your energy. And as that fuel ignites, you move with precision. You move with focus. You move with an understanding of timing and placement that leaves people stunned. Because everything you do now is deliberate. Every decision carries weight. Every move signals purpose. And they're watching, trapped in their own astonishment, unable to intervene, unable to reclaim anything, unable to touch what belongs to you. And baby, this is when your life starts to separate fully from theirs. The people who once tried to control you, to diminish you, to manipulate you, they find themselves in a space of irrelevance. Your energy no longer answers to their attempts. Your progress no longer aligns with their interference. Your peace no longer bends to their chaos. The very people who believed they could come against you are now mere spectators to your power. And this is the part that unsettles them the most. They wanted to test you, to see if your resilience had limits, to see if you could be broken. But what they failed to realize is that every challenge they threw at you was a setup for your breakthrough. Every obstacle became a building block. Every betrayal became a lesson in discernment. Every interference became proof of your alignment. And now, as you stand fully in your purpose, they are left to reckon with the reality that they underestimated what cannot be underestimated. And baby, let's be clear. The people who tried to come against you are not just witnessing your rise. They are feeling it. They feel it in the conversations they cannot control, in the opportunities they cannot access, in the influence they can no longer exert. Every place they thought they had power over you. Every area where they believed they could dictate outcomes. Every space they assumed you would stumble. It's all been reclaimed, repurposed, and elevated. And the deeper truth is that their shock will continue to compound. Because every new blessing, every new alignment, every new stage of your life will only reinforce one undeniable fact. You were never theirs to diminish. You were never theirs to manipulate. And coming against you, was the gravest miscalculation of their existence. And baby, the weight of that realization will grow heavier with every step you take forward. Because what they cannot see yet, but will soon, is that this is more than just victory. This is transformation. This is evolution. This is authority that cannot be challenged because it is rooted in alignment, strategy, discernment, and divine guidance. This is presence that moves quietly yet powerfully, commanding attention without effort. This is a life that now flows according to laws they can no longer bend, rules they can no longer influence, and timing they can no longer disrupt. And while they scramble to make sense of it, you are walking fully in your sovereignty, fully in your calling, fully untouchable, and fully recognized by the universe for the power and purpose you embody. And baby, that power is magnetic. People are drawn to it, compelled by it, influenced by it, inspired by it. But unlike before, you now have the clarity to choose who you allow near, who you engage with, and who aligns with your energy. The people who are meant to celebrate your victories, who are meant to witness your rise, who are meant to walk in step with your purpose, they find their way naturally. The people who are not meant to be part of your evolution, they become irrelevant, invisible, or incapable of interfering. And as this discernment solidifies, your life becomes an environment of intentionality. Every relationship, every partnership, every decision, every move is deliberate, and the ones who tried to come against you can only watch as you redefine the standards of influence, power, and divine alignment. And baby, here's the real kicker. The more you rise, the more they realize that what they thought was their advantage was never theirs at all. They thought control, manipulation, secrecy, and deceit could shape your path. They thought fear, doubt, and projection could stall your momentum. They thought envy, competition, and intimidation could derail your progress. And now, they are seeing clearly that their attempts only ensured your elevation. Every strategy they deployed, every tactic they believed would work, it didn't, and it won't. You are now operating from a plane of clarity and power, where such attempts have no impact. They are powerless against what they tried to attack, because the attack itself has become the engine of your growth. And baby, let's talk about the visibility of this moment. The people who once doubted you, mocked you, and underestimated you, they are now forced to acknowledge it. They see the results, they hear the conversations, they witness the recognition, they experience the opportunities, they feel the respect that comes to you effortlessly because your alignment demands it. And they can't understand how it happened. They can't decipher the method. They can't name the force. They only know one thing. Their L was monumental, and they will feel it for as long as they observe your rise. And that observation, it's a lesson for them, a warning for others, and a confirmation for you that every moment of struggle, every trial, every moment of endurance, every decision to walk away from those who didn't serve you, every boundary you enforced, every prayer you whispered in secret, it was all preparation for this. It was all set up. It was all inevitable. Not because of them, but because of the alignment you were destined to inhabit. And baby, the ultimate beauty of this is that your rise doesn't depend on their acknowledgement. It doesn't rely on their approval. It doesn't hinge on them realizing their mistakes. Your elevation is independent. Your power is sovereign. Your clarity is unshakable. Your path is illuminated. And the more you operate from that space, the less space remains for doubt, for regret, for distraction. You no longer need to chase validation. You no longer need to explain yourself. You no longer need to make room for those who weren't ready for your light. You've stepped fully into the life you were always meant to lead, and anyone who cannot align with it naturally falls away. And baby, as you continue to step into this full expression, something powerful occurs. A sense of untouchable momentum, a force that cannot be interrupted, a trajectory that cannot be delayed, a clarity that cannot be confused. And the people who thought they could come against you, they realized too late that what they once tried to undermine is now unassailable. They see the strategic moves, the elevated choices, the divine alignment, the unstoppable energy, and they are forced to recognize their own limitations. The people who attempted to question your worth, interfere with your growth, and manipulate your journey are left observing from a place of powerless astonishment. And baby, that astonishment is proof. Proof that the strategy, the patience, the resilience, the wisdom, and the alignment you invested in are unstoppable. And the final piece, the part that solidifies this story forever. Your life now operates on a frequency that cannot be matched by people who were never prepared to operate at that level. Your energy has become authority. Your presence has become influence. Your alignment has become protection. Your boundaries have become strategy. And as your life continues to expand into this higher calling, the people who came against you are now spectators to a reality they tried to disrupt but could never touch, a life they tried to influence but could never shape, and a destiny they tried to interfere with but could never alter. They took an L so significant that even time itself cannot erase the impact of their miscalculation. And baby, here's the ultimate truth to close this story. Your rise is complete, not because of them, but because of who you chose to be, the alignment you chose to hold, the standards you refused to compromise, the faith you refused to shake, and the authority you claimed as your own. And the ones who came against you, they will never forget the day they misjudged you, the day they underestimated you, the day they tried to manipulate you, the day they thought you could be diminished, because that day was the day they ensured their own defeat. And as your life continues to unfold, as your energy continues to expand, as your alignment continues to deepen, and as your presence continues to elevate, the record is crystal clear. Coming against you was the biggest L they've ever taken. And baby, they will never live it down.